She outlived the most feared man in the Third Reich. She buried the butcher of Prague. She raised his children in silence. And then, decades later, history came for her too. But not in the way you'd expect. What happened to Lina Heydrich wasn't just death. It was a long, painful unraveling of power, of memory, of identity that nobody talks about. Until today. Because here's the thing most history channels skip. The execution of Lina Heydrich wasn't a bullet. It wasn't a courtroom. It was something far more brutal and far more human. Stay with me, because this story gets darker before it gets clearer. Welcome back to Nazi Dark History, where we don't just tell you what happened. We tell you what it felt like to live through it, survive it, and in some cases, wish you hadn't. Today we're talking about a woman who most people have never heard of. And that invisibility, that was intentional. Lina Heydrich was the wife of Reinhard Heydrich, the man Heinrich Himmler once called the man with the iron heart, the man Hitler personally tasked with organizing the Holocaust, the man who, on January 20, 1942, chaired the Wannsee Conference, the meeting where senior Nazi officials sat around a table and scheduled the murder of millions of Jewish people. That man was her husband, and she loved him. That's the part that makes this story uncomfortable, because Lina wasn't just standing in the shadows, she was in it. If you're new here, hit subscribe. Nazi Dark History drops deep dives like this every week. We don't sugarcoat, we don't sensationalize, we go in. All right, let's go. Born Lina von Osten in 1911 on the German island of Fehmarn, she was the daughter of a schoolteacher. Educated, ambitious, sharp. She wasn't dragged into Nazi ideology, she walked into it. When she met Reinhard Heydrich in 1930, he was a young, dismissed naval officer, recently fired for dishonoring another woman he'd promised to marry. He had charm, yes, but no future, no rank, no direction. Lina saw something in him anyway. And here's where the story gets strange. She actually introduced him to the SS. She encouraged him to pursue Heinrich Himmler. She helped build the monster history remembers. Whether she knew what she was building, that's the question she spent the rest of her life refusing to answer. They married in December 1931. Reinhard rose fast, terrifyingly fast. By 1934, he headed the SD, the Nazi intelligence service. By 1941, he was Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia. He was being groomed as Hitler's successor. Lina wasn't just the wife of a powerful man. She was the woman behind one of the most dangerous men alive. And she was proud of it. But power like that doesn't last. It never does. On May 27, 1942, British-trained Czech and Slovak paratroopers ambushed Reinhard Heydrich's car on a sharp bend in Prague. A grenade, a burst of gunfire, and suddenly, the butcher of Prague was bleeding out in his own vehicle. He died 8 days later, on June 4, 1942. And Lina Heydrich became a widow at 30 years old. What happened next is what most people don't know. She was 30 years old, a widow, 4 children, and a last name that the entire world had learned to fear. Reinhard Heydrich was dead, but Lina was still standing. And that, for a lot of people, was already unforgivable. Because when the war ends, history doesn't just forget the wives of monsters. Sometimes it hunts them. But before we get to what the world did to Lina Heydrich, we need to understand what she did first. Because this woman didn't quietly disappear into grief. She made choices. Deliberate, calculated, unapologetic choices. And those choices would define the rest of her life. After Reinhard's death, Hitler personally attended the state funeral in Berlin. Lina stood beside the coffin, composed, dressed in black, children at her side. No tears in public, not one. Those who were there said she looked like she was made of stone. But inside, she was already calculating. Hitler rewarded Lina generously. She was given a large estate, Jungfernbrechen, in occupied Czechoslovakia, the same land that had been seized from Czech families. She moved in. She ran it. She lived well while the people whose country her husband had terrorized starved and bled outside her gates. Let that image sit for a moment. She wasn't just surviving in the wreckage of Nazism. She was comfortable in it. But 1945 was coming, and with it, everything collapsed. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Lina's world shattered overnight. The estate was gone. The title was gone. The protection was gone. She fled Czechoslovakia with her children, and what she returned to was rubble financially, socially, completely. For a brief period, she was arrested and held by Allied authorities, investigated, questioned, and then released. No trial, no conviction, no prison sentence. Here's the part that made survivors furious for decades. Lina Heydrich walked free. While the Nuremberg trials were prosecuting the architects of the Holocaust, while men who followed Reinhard Heydrich's orders were being hanged, his wife, the woman who had enabled him, encouraged him, and benefited directly from his crimes, received no formal punishment. She moved to Bavaria, quietly, anonymously, almost. But Lina Heydrich was not a quiet woman. For years, she kept a low profile, raising her children, struggling financially, occasionally giving closed interviews. People knew who she was. Most pretended they didn't. Then in 1976, 31 years after the war ended, Lina Heydrich published a memoir. She called it Leben mit einem Kriegsverbrecher, Life with a War Criminal. And the title alone tells you exactly how she played it. She didn't deny Reinhard's crimes outright. That would have been too obvious, too easily dismantled. Instead, she did something more dangerous. She reframed him. She painted him as a complex man, a misunderstood man, a man the system used and ultimately destroyed. She positioned herself as a victim, a loyal wife caught in history's machinery. The German public reacted with outrage. Jewish organizations condemned it. Historians tore it apart line by line. But it sold, and Lina Heydrich made money from it. She used those royalties to pursue something that stunned legal experts across Europe. She filed lawsuits against the German government, demanding the widow's pension she believed she was owed as the wife of a senior SS officer. You read that correctly. She wanted Germany to pay her for being Reinhard Heydrich's widow. The legal battles dragged on for years, ugly, public, humiliating for everyone involved. West Germany eventually paid her a reduced settlement in the 1960s, before the memoir, just to make her go away. But she didn't go away. She never went away. And here is where the true punishment of Lina Heydrich starts, not the kind with handcuffs or courtrooms, the kind that happens slowly, in isolation, in irrelevance. Because by the 1970s and 80s, the world had moved on. The children of Holocaust survivors were now adults. Memory was becoming activism. History was being excavated with a scalpel. And Lina Heydrich, aging, increasingly alone on the island of Fehmarn where she'd retired, found herself becoming something she had never prepared for. A symbol of shame that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Former Nazi social circles dissolved. Old connections died or disappeared. Her children, whatever their own complicated feelings, lived their own lives. She gave the occasional interview, still sharp, still unapologetic in tone, but the audience was shrinking. The woman who had once stood inside the machinery of the Third Reich, who had hosted SS officers at dinner, who had worn power like a coat, was now an elderly woman on a small German island, largely ignored. And there is something in that, something history rarely names. That is its own kind of slow execution. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just the long, grinding erasure of relevance, of consequence, of being seen. But there's one final chapter, and it answers the question this video opened with. Because Lina Heydrich didn't just fade quietly. In her final years, something happened that forced Germany and history to look at her one last time. And it is the most painful part of this entire story. She survived the war. She survived the investigations. She survived the public outrage, the lawsuits, the memoir backlash, the decades of quiet condemnation. But there are things time does to a person that no court ever could. And Lina Heydrich, in her final years, discovered exactly what those things were. This is the part of her story that history books skip, because it isn't dramatic. There's no single moment of justice, no gavel, no sentence read aloud in a packed courtroom. What happened to Lina Heydrich at the end was quieter than that. And somehow, because of that, far more devastating. By the late 1970s, Lina had returned permanently to Fehmarn, the same small Baltic island where she was born. She ran a small restaurant there for a period. Locals knew who she was. Most said nothing. She was old, she was tired, and she was alone in a way that went beyond physical solitude. Think about what that means for a moment. This was a woman who had once moved through the highest circles of the Third Reich, who had dined with Heinrich Himmler, whose husband had been one of the most powerful and feared men in Nazi Germany, who had lived on a seized estate in occupied Czechoslovakia, while the people of that country suffered under her husband's reign of terror. Now she was serving food to tourists on a small German island. The contrast alone is its own kind of verdict. But it gets more painful than that. Lina had 4 children with Reinhard: Klaus, Heider, Silke, and Mart. They grew up carrying one of the most poisoned surnames in modern history. And here is something that almost never gets discussed. What does it do to a child to grow up as the son or daughter of Reinhard Heydrich, to go to school with that name, to watch your mother defend your father's legacy publicly while the rest of the world called him a mass murderer? Accounts from people who knew the family suggest the children lived fractured, complicated lives, caught between a mother who refused to fully condemn their father and a society that never let them forget who he was. Lina never publicly encouraged her children to reject Reinhard's memory. She never gave them that release. And in that silence, in that refusal to say the words that might have freed them, there is a cruelty that has nothing to do with politics. That is deeply, uncomfortably human. In her final years, Lina gave a handful of interviews. German journalists, documentary filmmakers, historians, they came to Fehmarn looking for remorse, looking for the moment an old woman facing the end of her life finally breaks. She never broke. In interviews recorded in the early 1980s, she spoke about Reinhard with a complicated mixture of loyalty and deflection. She acknowledged that terrible things happened under National Socialism, but she consistently positioned herself and her husband as people swept up in historical forces larger than themselves. She never said the words survivors needed to hear. Not once. And you have to sit with that, because it raises a question that has no clean answer. What do we do with people who participate in evil, benefit from evil, enable evil, and then simply refuse to feel sorry? There is no courtroom for that, no sentence that fits. Just the long, uncomfortable weight of it, carried by survivors, by victims' families, by history itself. Lina Heydrich died on August 14, 1985. She was 73 years old. She died on the island where she was born, the same quiet stretch of Baltic coastline she had left as a young, ambitious woman who wanted more than a schoolteacher's daughter's life. She got more, far more than she should have. And at the end, it was taken back, not in one dramatic moment, but piece by piece. The estate, the status, the social world, the relevance, the audience for her justifications. The German government issued no statement. There was no national moment of reckoning. She was buried quietly. But here is what happened after she died, and this is the part that matters most. The Czech Republic remembered. In the years following her death, as the Cold War ended and Eastern Europe began excavating its own history, the story of Reinhard Heydrich's reign of terror in Prague was told again, loudly, publicly, in museums, in memorials, in schools. The village of Lidice, which Hitler had ordered completely destroyed as revenge for Reinhard's assassination, every man executed, women and children sent to concentration camps. That village rebuilt itself, and it made sure the world knew why it had been destroyed. Lina Heydrich's name appeared in those histories, not as a footnote, as a participant. And the survivors of Czechoslovakia's Nazi occupation, and their children and grandchildren, made certain she was not remembered the way she wanted to be remembered. That is the execution history finally carried out. Not a bullet, not a prison cell. The permanent, unrevocable record. Here's what I want you to take from this story. Evil rarely ends in a single dramatic moment of justice. The world doesn't always give us that. Sometimes the people most responsible for catastrophic harm live long lives, die in their beds, and never face a courtroom. But history, real, documented, carefully preserved history, has a longer reach than any court. Lina Heydrich spent 40 years trying to control her own narrative, and in the end, she couldn't. Because the people her husband's regime tried to erase, they survived. They testified. They built memorials. They made sure their story was louder than hers. That is not a small thing. That is everything. If this video made you think, share it. Not for the algorithm, because stories like this deserve to be heard by people who are willing to sit with the discomfort they produce. Nazi Dark History is here every week. We go deep, we go honest, and we never look away. Subscribe if you haven't, and we'll see you in the next one.